Welcome to Global Insider Talks. Going global does not come without its fair share of risk, and entering a new market is not easy, and many multinational corporations fail to understand how to protect themselves from getting into trouble. So today, I'm pleased to be joined by Brian Whistler, who's been a partner with the global law firm Baker & McKenzie for 15 years in their Washington, D.C. office. Brian is an expert on anti-corruption enforcement and international sanctions, and these are the topics we will focus on for our interview today. I might also mention that Brian served for 15 years as a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice. He's also worked in academia as an adjunct professor at the University of Richmond T.C. Williams School of Law and at the National Advocacy Center for the U.S. Justice Department in Columbia, South Carolina. Brian, welcome.
Great to be with you, Jeff. Thanks for having me, and thanks to Factum for putting this forward.
Thanks so much for being with us. We're truly fascinated by your background, and we're anxious to hear what you have to say. So let's jump right in. So let's set the scene, Brian, for our viewers on this subject. So what are we talking about when we say anti-corruption?
Yeah, it's great to frame it up in that fashion to have context, and I think it's important to highlight a couple of things. So when we generally talk about anti-corruption, that's conventionally understood to mean public corruption, that is, corrupt payments or corrupt conduct associated with interchanges with government officials. More broadly speaking, it can also encompass a wider range of conduct to include commercial bribery, kickbacks, and money laundering, all of which are topics that are prominent for not only U.S. Enforcement authorities, but also their counterparts ex-U.S.
So thanks for that setting the foundation, Brian. So what are, in your experience, and maybe in some of the things you're dealing with today, what are some of the big issues companies are faced with from an anti-corruption standpoint?
Yeah, I think I would kind of frame it like this. I think from an anti-corruption standpoint, multinationals have an increasingly important need to be sensitive to the potential corruption. And why do I say that? Well, because corruption in many places around the globe has proven to be endemic, almost intractable in some places. And it has such enormous consequences, geopolitically, legally, commercially, and reputationally. And so if you're doing business at a global level, it's absolutely imperative that you're sensitive to this issue. You're sensitive of the enforcement regimes that are operating in the area where you're conducting business and this risk that it poses to your company.
Brian, that's helpful. Let's peel the onion a little bit more and let me see if you can articulate what being sensitive to anti-corruption means. Like how if I'm an executive operating globally, what should I be monitoring the international regulators? What are some practical things that I should be doing to be sensitive?
Yeah, well, I think you have to, first of all, have a clear understanding of what your level of risk is. And that level of risk is a combination of multiple factors, right? So you have geographical risk in the markets that you operate. You have legal risk, depending on the legal regime under which you operate, which can include the likes of the U.S. that have extraterritorial jurisdiction, where they basically are policing the globe. And now other regulators, such as in the UK, that also have expansive extraterritorial jurisdiction. So you have to have an awareness of that. And finally, an awareness of where could the problems emerge. And generally speaking, corruption risk is largely centered around how third parties are used as intermediaries in your sales channel. And it's the third party activity that constitutes the lion's share of enforcement activity in this space.
Are there certain bodies or institutions in the U.S., say I'm a U.S.-based company working globally, are there certain institutions that I, as an executive, can rely on as a sort of a checkpoint to make sure that my business is being conducted properly? Is there a way to check in before going forward? And what is that institution that I should be relying on?
Well, there's of course lots of resources that the U.S. authorities and their counterparts abroad bring to bear to help educate companies, whether they are coming to market in the U.S. or are they moving abroad to other markets where they nevertheless may remain subject to U.S. jurisdiction. The U.S. Commerce Department, for example, puts out a lot of information to assist companies in navigating this area of risk. The U.S. Justice Department, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission put out guidance on what to be looking for when entering into challenging markets and managing this area of risk. Lots of information.
Shouldn't be any surprises, right? We should have our legal teams make sure that we're checking all the boxes to make sure we're mitigating our risk. Okay,
that's right.
Let's jump, in the interest of time, to sanctions. We haven't really discussed this yet, but in the news we've heard lately all about how the Russian oligarchs have been sanctioned, and in light of the Russian invasion on Ukraine. How are sanctions and other similar types of government actions used to combat illegal activity like this?
Yeah, obviously a great question and very timely. I mean, sanctions are, they're a tool that are used to basically implement political and legal and market-based responses, right? And so to your example, I mean, in Russia, obviously there's a very self-evident political element to the sanctions. But I think this is where it gets interesting in terms of the intersection between sanctions and corruption, right? Is that the sanctions are designed to address what's perceived as systemic corruption, right? And that's often the case in terms of the predicates for sanctions and sanctionable activity. Certainly the case in this context with U.S. sanctions vis-a-vis Russia, but also in terms of UN sanctions, sanctions brought to bear by international financial institutions and multilateral development banks that have their own sanctions regimes. All of those things are designed to address oftentimes corrupt conduct and to incentivize companies to basically steer clear of dealing with corrupt actors.
Right, and they seem to be tools that work quite well, as we see in today's global economy.
Right.
So let's get back to working in foreign markets. So oftentimes our viewers learn very well from case studies and situations where maybe things have gone wrong or things have gone right. In this case, I wonder, can you give us an example of a company that maybe made a drastic mistake, whether they knew that they were doing it or not, and what can be done differently in that case to protect themselves?
Yeah, unfortunately, I've encountered more than one company that labored under the belief that they were largely immune from issues stemming from corruption. And that belief, I think, in part was founded by the fact of where I'm thinking of one company in particular, their geographical headquarters was in a place where the perception of corruption is generally fairly low. But they were a global company, they are a global company, and they had problems in other regions, very decentralized company, that they really weren't monitoring. They didn't have any meaningful compliance structure. Yeah. And these problems emerged very quickly and caught the company off guard. And so they had to react and weren't able to be kind of preemptive and anticipate problems. And so that's an example of something I encounter not infrequently, which just a kind of a false assumption about the culture, a false assumption about kind of how geography plays into the mix. And I think, frankly, it sometimes reveals a somewhat naivete about kind of the human condition. So, yeah, I have encountered that for sure.
Yeah. So what if I were to say, well, that's just how business is done in this country? What would you say to me? I'm really struggling to, have my products produced or get those shipments off of the loading dock, or, that's just how things are done here. What would you say to me?
Yeah. Those days are gone, right? I mean, there was a time when I can think of at least one jurisdiction where bribes were tax deductible on the books of companies, right? That's a long time ago. We're in a totally new era now. And the problem is that, competition is admittedly very sharp, and there's lots of sales pressure, and things need to get done. But the offsetting problem here is that the costs associated with overlooking or mismanaging corrupt conduct are too high, right? If you look at the top 10 settlements now in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act space, we are talking the billions of dollars. When I started at Baker in 2008, the highest settlement for an FCPA case in terms of financial penalties was $44 million.
Wow.
And that's been wildly eclipsed. And we're in the billions. And it's not just the legal consequences, right? It's the reputational consequences that sometimes have equal significance, right, in terms of the collateral consequences of these type of actions.
Right. Brian, fascinating discussion. We're at the end of our time here, but I want to give you a chance to just leave our viewers with, some last pieces of advice.
Yeah, I think just monitoring your own internal landscape, meaning assess your risk, right? I mean, and by assessing risk, I mean, I'm talking about tiering what levels of risk you are at in each jurisdiction where you operate, understanding how are our third parties being managed, those particularly who are interfacing with government officials. That's going to take you a long way down the field in terms of understanding this area of risk and your overall risk profile.
Yeah, very good, Brian. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. And I invite you all to visit factumglobal.com for more information about our Global Insider Talks interview series and for more about our services. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.